try to go through today is we're going to go through f-stops, also our aperture, and then we're also going to go through the exposure triangle. Now the exposure triangle of how we take photos is that if you move your ISO, you move your aperture, you move your f-stop, or you move your shutter, one of the other things also has to move. So what you have to do is that if you want to change your ISO, you also have to change your aperture. If you want to change your shutter speed, you have to either change your aperture or your ISO as well. So when it comes to anything that you do with your camera, you have to change something when you change one of your other options. So that's what we're kind of going to go through today. So like let's say today right now I'm shooting at, let me look here, ISO 100, f-stop 1.4, and our shutter speed is at 8,000th of a second. So what'll happen is that if I want to, like let's say, boost up my, bring up my aperture, like let's say to shoot at a 5.6 or maybe an f8, I would probably have to, and not probably, I would have to change either my ISO, okay, to come up, make it faster, or I would have to change my shutter speed, make it slower. In order to like allow more available light to come in. That's kind of how it works. If you change one up, the others have to go down, or if you change one down, the others have to go up. So what I'm going to do right now real quick is just kind of go through and kind of try to explain the aperture, and I'm going to take some photos. So aperture, if we remember, has to do with the creaminess, the blurriness of the depth of field of whatever's in focus. So what we need to do is that I'm going to first start out by shooting a 1.4. So let me take a photo real quick. We're going to actually shoot this right here, shoot this colorful whale tail. Okay, so what I'm going to do, get focused up, shoot it at 1.4. okay, so here's my settings here. So I'm shooting 8,000, 1.4, ISO 100. Now if I want to switch, like let's say that photo I just took right now, the whale is going to be in focus, but everything in the background is going to be blurred out, okay? So what we're going to have to do is that if I want to make the background in focus, let's go ahead and shoot f8. I'm going to have to move my shutter speed now down to about 800, okay? So let me shoot that real quick. We actually got to move it even more. We got to shoot at 250. Okay. Now what I'm doing is that I am metering in camera. So what metering means is that down here at the bottom, okay, hopefully you can see that. Let's get you right there. Is that right below that ISO 100, you can see the -3 and the +3. Okay. If I half press down on the shutter right here, is that you're going to see that it moves based on how much light is coming into the camera. So what's happening is that little bar right there that moves and everything is my metering process. That tells me if the actual shot is metered correctly, if the right amount of light is coming in and exposing the sensor properly based on what my shutter, my aperture, and my ISO is. So you use that, okay, when you take a photo to actually tell yourself or tell the camera if your camera is actually metered properly. So what you want to be able to do is that when you actually go through your process based on changing your ISO, changing your shutter speed, changing the aperture and everything, is that it is going to tell you and allow you to be able to take the photo and expose it correctly. So you know, knowing those numbers, knowing the exposure triangle really helps. If you bring up your ISO, your aperture, okay, either needs to go up or your shutter needs to become faster. If you bring your ISO or your film speed down, you have to open up, okay, your aperture wider, okay, and the number is going to go down, and it's actually going to make everything exposed correctly, okay. Another one little thing about our lenses and the aperture itself, okay, there's a couple things that happen when you open up your aperture or when you close your aperture, close the lens, okay, is that what happens is that if you think of like f16, okay, or f8, the lens opening is going to be like this big. It is really small, okay. When you open it up, okay, the number, your aperture is going to get smaller, but the opening is going to get bigger. Okay, so like the easiest way that I always remembered it when I was learning is that f1.4 or f1.8, it's really wide open within the lens. Okay, and if you tighten it up, if you go to a bigger number, the actual opening gets smaller. Okay, that's kind of an easy way to remember it. The numbers get bigger, your actual lens opening gets smaller. Okay, and vice versa, is that if you want to shoot at f2.8 or f4 or 1.4, 1.8, okay, the actual opening in the lens gets even bigger. So what you want to be able to do is that depending on what you want your final image or your final outtake to be and everything, is that you kind of have to be the control. That's why we shoot in manual. In order for us to be able to get the right storytelling presence within our images and everything, or film, it works the same way since we can shoot film in this. Okay, I will shoot some film, so we'll kind of go through the difference here. Is that if I switch over to my video mode and I want to shoot this image, okay, and like let's say I want this to be in focus here, this whale, and I want everything around it to be out of focus, okay, I can expose properly based on my image. When you go over to the video mode within aperture and everything, and if you want to shoot your video mode, and since we're just working on aperture, okay, I'm going to press the start button up here on my video, and it's going to start recording. Okay, so what's happening right now is that my video is actually recording, and what I want to be able to do, we got some people here walking by, so it'll kind of show you. They're going to walk in and walk out, and they're going to get blurry when that happens. Okay, the farther they get away, the blurrier they're going to get. All right, that's kind of how aperture works. You know, it depends on what we want our final image to look like, or our final reel to look like if we're shooting film. Okay, I'm going to stop that right now. So what'll happen is that when you think about what you want your final image to be, okay, you kind of want to think is that if it's going to be in focus or out of focus, or what your hero is. That's also when we talk about heroes and everything. Your heroes are going to be something that happens and what you want your final image to look like. Your hero is where you want the main focus of your image to be. Okay, and aperture plays a very, very big part on that. It tells us what we want our eyes to focus in when we look at a picture. That's why aperture is so important. So when we jump back into, you know, getting lenses that are really fast or have a f-stop, okay, that's really low, like 1.4 or 1.8 or 2.8 or 1.2 even, is that those lenses get really expensive. Okay, the majority of you guys, especially if you buy a kit lens or a kit like let's say at Costco that has your camera body and your lens, you guys are most likely going to have lenses like f4 or f5.6. okay, to get down into those lenses that have like 1.4 to provide those really creamy backgrounds and everything. There's a couple options that you can take. Is that if you do buy a kit lens, it's like let's say f4 or f5.6, and maybe it's around a 70 to 200 lens or something, or maybe a 15 to 70, depending on those lenses. Is that if you actually go with much more of a, like let's say 70 millimeter shot, okay, with like let's say an f4 or f5.6, your background is actually going to look more blurred out using that. The farther you get away from your subject based on the lens choice, if it zooms, if it's a telephoto, it'll actually help your background become more blurry. Okay, that's one way to kind of do it. Is that the other way to also do it, depending on what your focal range is, when you can actually focus based on your image, okay, is that the closer you get to your subject on a longer lens, the background is going to also become more blurry. Since I'm shooting with a 35 here on this camera, is that the 35 millimeter is very wide. Okay, so I kind of have to get somewhat close up to my subject in order to fill the frame. But also, the closer I get to my subject, the background is also going to become more blurry based on whatever my depth of field is on whatever I'm focusing. So hopefully, if we really think about our depth of field and the aperture, okay, the lower the number, okay, the more creamy the background is going to get. There's also a couple other things that we got to remember though, based on what our aperture and everything happens. That exposure triangle is really, really important. In order for us to be able to get the actual shot that we want now, okay, it's really important for us to remember is that in that exposure triangle, if we adjust anything, one has to move up and one has to move down based on whatever we're actually trying to shoot. Okay, aperture is really important. It tells our story. It helps tell us where we want to focus in on our actual hero shot. Okay, so hopefully that helps with our depth of field, the aperture, being able to focus in on what we need. Just always remember, the lower the number, okay, the blurrier background. the higher the number within our aperture, the f-stop, okay, the more is actually going to be in focus. All right.